Master word list. Words starting with letter P. Pachyderm means thick-skinned animal. For example, the elephant is probably the best-known pachyderm. Pacifist means one opposed to force. For example, shooting his way through the jungle, Rambo was clearly not a pacifist. Pacify means soothe, make calm or quiet, subdue. For example, dentists criticize the practice of giving fussy children sweets to pacify them. Pact means agreement, treaty. For example, Tweedledum and Tweedledee made a pact not to quarrel anymore. Paean means song of praise or joy. For example, paeans celebrating the victory filled the air. Painstaking means showing hard work, taking great care. For example, the new high-frequency word list is the result of painstaking efforts on the part of our research staff. Palatable means agreeable, pleasing to the taste. For example, neither Jack's underbaked opinions nor his overcooked casseroles were palatable to Jill. Paleontology means study of prehistoric life. For example, the paleontology instructor had a superb collection of fossils. Palette means board on which painter mixes pigments. For example, at the present time, art supply stores are selling a paper palette that may be discarded after use. Pall means grow tiresome. For example, the study of word lists can eventually pall and put one to sleep. Palliate means alleviate, moderate intensity. For example, not content merely to palliate the patient's sores and cankers, the researchers sought a means of wiping out the disease. Pallid means pale. For example, because his job required that he work at night and sleep during the day, he had an exceptionally pallid complexion. Palpable means tangible, unmistakable. For example, the patient's enlarged spleen was palpable, even the first-year medical student could feel it. Palpitate means throb, flutter. For example, as he became excited, his heart began to palpitate more and more erratically. Paltry means insignificant, petty. For example, $100 for a genuine imitation Rolex watch. Lady, this is a paltry sum to pay for such a high-class piece of jewelry. Pan means criticize harshly. For example, hoping for a rave review of his new show, the playwright was miserable when the critics panned it unanimously. Panacea means cure-all, remedy for all diseases. For example, the rich youth cynically declared that the panacea for all speeding tickets was a big enough bribe. Panache means flair, flamboyance. For example, many performers imitate Noel Coward, but few have his panache and sense of style. Pandemic means widespread, affecting the majority of people. For example, they feared the AIDS epidemic would soon reach pandemic proportions. Pandemonium means wild tumult. For example, when the ships collided in the harbor, pandemonium broke out among the passengers. Pander means cater to the low desires of others. For example, the reviewer accused the makers of Lethal Weapon of pandering to the masses' taste for violence. Panegyric means formal praise. For example, blushing at all the praise heaped upon him by the speakers, the modest hero said, "I don't deserve such panegyrics." Panoramic means related to an unobstructed view. For example, on a clear day, from the top of the World Trade Center you can get a panoramic view of New York City and parts of New Jersey and Long Island. Pantomime means acting without dialogue. For example, because he worked in pantomime, the clown could be understood wherever he appeared. Papyrus means ancient paper made from stem of papyrus plant. For example, the ancient Egyptians were among the first to write on papyrus. Parable means simple story teaching a moral. For example, let us apply to our own conduct the lesson that this parable teaches. Paradigm means model, pattern. For example, Pavlov's experiment in which he trains a dog to salivate on hearing a bell is a paradigm of the conditioned response experiment in behavioral psychology. Paradox means something apparently contradictory in nature. For example, Richard presents a bit of a paradox, for he is a card-carrying member of both the National Rifle Association and the relatively pacifist American Civil Liberties Union. Paragon means model of perfection. For example, her fellow students dislike Lavinia because Miss Minchin always pointed her out as a paragon of virtue. Parallelism means state of being parallel. For example, although the twins were separated at birth and grew up in different adoptive families, a striking parallelism exists between their lives. Paramount means foremost in importance, supreme. For example, proper nutrition and hygiene are of paramount importance in adolescent development and growth. Paranoia means psychosis marked by delusions of grandeur. For example, suffering from paranoia, Don claimed everyone was out to get him. Ironically, his claim was accurate, even paranoides have enemies. Paraphernalia means equipment, odds and ends. For example, his desk was cluttered with paper, pen, ink, dictionary and other paraphernalia of the writing craft. Paraphrase means restate a passage in one's own words while retaining thought of author. For example, in 250 words or less, paraphrase this article. Parasite means animal or plant living on another. For example, the tapeworm is an example of the kind of parasite that may infest the human body. Parched means extremely dry, very thirsty. For example, the parched desert landscape seemed hostile to life. Pariah means social outcast. For example, if everyone ostracized singer Mariah Carey, would she then be Mariah the Pariah? Parity means equality in status or amount, close resemblance. For example, unfortunately, some doubt exists whether women's salaries will ever achieve parity with men's. Parochial means narrow in outlook. For example, although Jane Austen sets her novels in small rural communities, her concerns are universal, not parochial. Parody means humorous imitation, takeoff. For example, the show Forbidden Broadway presents parodies spoofing the year's new productions playing on Broadway. Paroxysm means fit or attack of pain, rage. For example, when he heard of his son's misdeeds, he was seized by a paroxysm of rage. Parry means ward off a blow, deflect. For example, unwilling to injure his opponent in such a pointless clash, D'Artagnan simply tried to parry his rival's thrusts. Parsimony means stinginess, excessive frugality. For example, furious because her father wouldn't let her buy out the clothing store, Annie accused him of parsimony. Partial means incomplete, having a liking for something. For example, in this issue we have published only a partial list of contributors because we lack space to acknowledge everyone. I am extremely partial to chocolate eclairs. Partiality means inclination, bias. For example, as a judge, not only must I be unbiased, but I must also avoid any evidence of partiality when I award the prize. Partisan means one-sided, prejudiced, committed to a party. For example, on certain issues of principle, she refused to take a partisan stand, but let her conscience be her guide. Partition means divide into parts. For example, before their second daughter was born, Jason and Lizzie decided each child needed a room of her own, and so they partitioned a large bedroom into two small but separate rooms. Passive means not active, acted upon. For example, Mahatma Gandhi urged his followers to pursue a program of passive resistance as he felt that it was more effective than violence and acts of terrorism. Passport means document identifying person as a citizen of a country. For example, in arranging your first trip abroad, be sure to allow yourself enough time to apply for and receive your passport. You won't be allowed to travel without one. Pastiche means imitation of another's style in musical composition. For example, we cannot even say that her music is a pastiche of this composer or that it is, rather, reminiscent of many musicians. Pastoral means rural. For example, in these stories of pastoral life, we find an understanding of the daily tasks of country folk. Patent means open for the public to read. For example, it was patent to everyone that the witness spoke the truth. Pathetic means causing sadness, compassion, pity. For example, everyone in the auditorium was weeping by the time he finished his pathetic tale about the orphaned boy. Pathological means related to the study of disease. For example, Jerome's pathological fear of germs led him to wash his hands 100 times a day. Pathos means tender sorrow, pity. For example, the quiet tone of pathos that ran through the novel never degenerated into the maudlin or the overly sentimental. Patina means tone slowly taken by varnished painting. For example, judging by the patina on this bronze statue, we can conclude that this is the work of a medieval artist. Patriarch means father and ruler of a family or tribe. For example, in many primitive tribes, the leader and lawmaker was the patriarch. Patrician means noble, aristocratic. For example, we greatly admired her well-bred, patrician elegance. Patronize means support, act superior toward. For example, penniless artists hope to find some wealthy art lover who will patronize them. Paucity means scarcity. For example, they closed the restaurant because the paucity of customers made it uneconomical to operate. Pauper means very poor person. For example, though Widow Brown was living on a reduced income, she was by no means a pauper. Peccadillo means slight offense. For example, when Peter Piper picked a peck of Polly Potter's pickles, did Pete commit a major crime or just a peccadillo? Pecuniary means pertaining to money. For example, seldom earning enough to cover their expenses, folk dance teachers work because they love dancing, not because they expect any pecuniary reward. Pedagogy means teaching, art of education. For example, though Maria Montessori gained fame for her innovations in pedagogy, it took years before her teaching techniques were common practice in American schools. Pedant means scholar who overemphasizes book learning. For example, her insistence that the book be memorized marked the teacher as a pedant rather than a scholar. Pedantic means showing off learning, bookish. For example, leavening his decisions with humorous, down-to-earth anecdotes, Judge Walker was not at all the pedantic legal scholar. Pedestrian means ordinary, unimaginative. For example, unintentionally boring, he wrote page after page of pedestrian prose. Pediatrician means expert in children's diseases. For example, the family doctor advised the parents to consult a pediatrician about their child's ailment. Peerless means having no equal, incomparable. For example, the reigning operatic tenor of his generation, to his admirers Luciano Pavarotti was peerless, no one could compare with him. Pejorative means negative in connotation. For example, instead of criticizing Clinton's policies, the Republicans made pejorative remarks about his character. Pellucid means transparent, easy to understand. For example, after reading these stodgy philosophers, I find Bertrand Russell's pellucid style very enjoyable. Penchant means strong inclination, liking. For example, Dave has a penchant for taking risks. One semester he went steady with 3 girls, 2 of whom were stars on the school karate team. Pendant means ornament. For example, the Grateful team presented the coach with a silver chain and pendant engraved with the school's motto. Penitent means repentant. For example, when he realized the enormity of his crime, he became remorseful and penitent. Pensive means dreamily thoughtful. For example, the pensive lover gazed at the portrait of his beloved and deeply sighed. Penury means severe poverty. For example, when his pension fund failed, George feared he would end his days in penury. Perceptive means insightful, aware, wise. For example, although Maud was a generally perceptive critic, she had her blind spots. She could never see flaws in the work of her friends. Percussion means striking one object against another sharply. For example, the drum is a percussion instrument. Perdition means damnation, complete ruin. For example, praying for salvation, young Stephen Dedalus feared he was damned to eternal perdition. Peregrination means journey. For example, Auntie Mame was a world traveler whose peregrinations took her from Tijuana to Timbuktu. Peremptory means demanding and leaving no choice. For example, from Jack's peremptory knock on the door, Jill could tell he would not give up until she let him in. Perennial means something that is continuing or recurrent. For example, these plants are hardy perennials and will bloom for many years. Perfidious means treacherous, disloyal. For example, when Caesar realized that Brutus had betrayed him, he reproached his perfidious friend. Perforate means pierce, put a hole through. For example, before you can open the aspirin bottle, you must first perforate the plastic safety seal that covers the cap. Perfunctory means superficial, not thorough, lacking interest. For example, the auditor's perfunctory inspection of the books overlooked many errors. Perimeter means outer boundary. For example, to find the perimeter of any quadrilateral, we add the lengths of the four sides. Peripheral means marginal, outer. For example, we lived not in central London, but in one of those peripheral suburbs that spring up on the outskirts of a great city. Periphery means edge, especially of a round surface. For example, he sensed that there was something just beyond the periphery of his vision. Perjury means false testimony while under oath. For example, rather than lie under oath and perhaps be indicted for perjury, the witness chose to take the Fifth Amendment, refusing to answer any questions on the grounds that he might incriminate himself. Permeable means penetrable, porous. For example, if your jogging clothes weren't made out of permeable fabric, you'd drown in your own perspiration. Permeate means pass through, spread. For example, the odor of frying onions permeated the air. Pernicious means very destructive. For example, crack cocaine has had a pernicious effect on urban society. It has destroyed families, turned children into drug dealers, and increased the spread of violent crimes. Perpetrate means commit an offense. For example, only an insane person could perpetrate such a horrible crime. Perpetual means everlasting. For example, Ponce de Leon hoped to find the legendary fountain of perpetual youth. Perpetuate means preserve from extinction. For example, some critics attack the adventures of Huckleberry Finn because they believe Twain's book perpetuates a false image of blacks in this country. Perquisite means any gain above stipulated salary. For example, the perquisites attached to this job make it even more attractive than the salary indicates. Persona means public personality or facade. For example, offstage the comedian was a sullen, irritable grumbler, a far cry from his ever-cheerful adopted stage persona. Personable means attractive. For example, the man I am seeking to fill this position must be personable since he will be representing us before the public. Perspicacious means having insight, penetrating. For example, the brilliant lawyer was known for his perspicacious deductions. Pert means impertinent, forward. For example, I think your pert and impudent remarks call for an apology. Pertinacious means stubborn, persistent. For example, he is bound to succeed because his pertinacious nature will not permit him to quit. Pertinent means to the point, relevant. For example, Virginia Woolf's words on women's rights are as pertinent today as they were when she wrote them nearly a century ago. Perturb means disturb greatly. For example, the thought that electricity might be leaking out of the empty light bulb sockets perturbed my aunt so much that at night she crept about the house screwing fresh bulbs in the vacant spots. Peruse means read with care. For example, after the conflagration that burned down her house, Joan closely perused her home insurance policy to discover exactly what benefits her coverage provided her. Pervasive means pervading, spread throughout every part. For example, despite airing them for several hours, Martha could not rid her clothes of the pervasive odor of mothballs that clung to them. Perverse means stubbornly wrong-headed, wicked and perverted. For example, when Jack was in a perverse mood, he would do the opposite of whatever Jill asked him. Pessimism means belief that life is basically bad or evil, gloominess. For example, considering how well you have done in the course so far, you have no real reason for such pessimism about your final grade. Petrify means turn to stone. For example, his sudden and unexpected appearance seemed to petrify her. Petty means trivial, unimportant. For example, she had no major complaints to make about his work, only a few petty quibbles that were almost too minor to state. Petulant means touchy, peevish. For example, if you'd had hardly any sleep for 3 nights and people kept phoning and waking you up, you'd sound pretty petulant too. Phenomena means observable facts, subjects of scientific investigation. For example, we kept careful records of the phenomena we noted in the course of these experiments. Philanderer means faithless lover, flirt. For example, swearing he had never so much as looked at another woman, Ralph assured Alice he was no philanderer. Philanthropist means lover of mankind, doer of good. For example, in his role as philanthropist and public benefactor, John D. Rockefeller, Sr., donated millions to charity. As an individual, however, he was a tight-fisted old man. Philistine means narrow-minded person, uncultured. For example, we need more men of culture and enlightenment. We have too many Philistines among us. Philology means study of language. For example, the professor of philology advocated the use of Esperanto as an international language. Phlegmatic means calm, not easily disturbed. For example, the nurse was a cheerful but phlegmatic person, unexcited in the face of sudden emergencies. Phobia means morbid fear. For example, her fear of flying was more than mere nervousness, it was a real phobia. Phoenix means symbol of immortality or rebirth. For example, like the legendary phoenix rising from its ashes, the city of San Francisco rose again after its destruction during the 1906 earthquake. Phylum means major class of plants. For example, in sorting out her hundreds of packets of seeds, Katya decided to file them by phylum. Physiological means pertaining to the science of the function of living organisms. For example, to understand this disease fully, we must examine not only its physiological aspects but also its psychological elements. Picaresque means pertaining to rogues in literature. For example, Tom Jones has been hailed as one of the best picaresque novels in the English language. Piebald means mottled, spotted. For example, you should be able to identify Polka Dot in this race, it is the only piebald horse running. Piecemeal means one piece at a time, gradually. For example, Tolstoy's War and Peace is too huge to finish in one sitting, I'll have to read it piecemeal. Pied means variegated, multicolored. For example, the Pied Piper of Hamelin got his name from the multicolored clothing he wore. Piety means religious devotion, godliness. For example, the nuns in the convent were noted for their piety, they spent their days in worship and prayer. Pigment means coloring matter. For example, Van Gogh mixed various pigments with linseed oil to create his paints. Pillage means plunder. For example, the enemy pillaged the quiet village and left it in ruins. Pine means languish, decline. For example, though she tried to be happy living with Clara in the city, Heidi pined for the mountains and for her gruff but loving grandfather. Pinnacle means peak. For example, we could see the morning sunlight illuminate the pinnacle while the rest of the mountain lay in shadow. Pious means devout, religious. For example, the challenge for church people today is how to be pious in the best sense, that is, to be devout without becoming hypocritical or sanctimonious. Piquant means pleasantly tart-tasting, stimulating. For example, the piquant sauce added to our enjoyment of the meal. Pique means irritation, resentment. For example, she showed her pique at her loss by refusing to appear with the other contestants at the end of the competition. Pique means provoke or arouse, annoy. For example, "I know something you don't know," said Lucy, trying to pique Ethel's interest. Pitfall means hidden danger, concealed trap. For example, her parents warned young Sophie against the many pitfalls that lay in wait for her in the dangerous big city. Pithy means concise, meaningful, substantial. For example, while other girls might have gone on and on about how uncool Elton was, Liz summed it up in one pithy remark: "He's bogus." Pittance means a small allowance or wage. For example, he could not live on the pittance he received as a pension and had to look for an additional source of revenue. Pivotal means crucial, key, vital. For example, the new smart weapons technology played a pivotal role in the quick resolution of the war with Iraq. Placate means pacify, conciliate. For example, the store manager tried to placate the angry customer, offering to replace the damaged merchandise or to give back her money right away. Placebo means harmless substance prescribed as a dummy pill. For example, in a controlled experiment, 50 volunteers were given aspirin tablets. The control group received only placebos. Placid means peaceful, calm. For example, after his vacation in this placid section, he felt soothed and rested. Plagiarism means theft of another's ideas or writings passed off as original. For example, the editor recognized the plagiarism and rebuked the culprit who had presented the manuscript as original. Plagiarize means steal another's ideas and pass them off as one's own. For example, the teacher could tell that the student had plagiarized parts of his essay. She could recognize whole paragraphs straight from Barron's book notes. Plaintive means mournful. For example, the dove has a plaintive and melancholy call. Plasticity means ability to be molded. For example, when clay dries out, it loses its plasticity and becomes less malleable. Platitude means trite remark, commonplace statement. For example, in giving advice to his son, old Polonius expressed himself only in platitudes. Every word out of his mouth was a commonplace. Plaudit means enthusiastically worded approval. For example, the theatrical company reprinted the plaudits of the critics in its advertisements. Plausible means having a show of truth, but open to doubt. For example, your mother made you stay home from school because she needed you to program the VCR? I'm sorry, you'll have to come up with a more plausible excuse than that. Plenitude means abundance, completeness. For example, looking in the pantry, we admired the plenitude of fruits and pickles we had preserved during the summer. Plethora means excess, overabundance. For example, she offered a plethora of excuses for her shortcomings. Pliable means flexible, yielding, adaptable. For example, in remodeling the bathroom, we have replaced all the old, rigid lead pipes with new, pliable copper tubing. Pliant means flexible, easily influenced. For example, Pinocchio's disposition was pliant, he was like putty in his tempter's hands. Plight means condition, state, predicament. For example, many people feel that the federal government should do more to alleviate the plight of the homeless. Plumb means checking perpendicularity. For example, before hanging wallpaper it is advisable to drop a plumb line from the ceiling as a guide. Plumage means feathers of a bird. For example, birdwatchers identify different species of bird by their characteristic songs and distinctive plumage. Plummet means fall sharply. For example, stock prices plummeted as Wall Street reacted to the crisis in the economy. Plutocracy means society ruled by the wealthy. For example, from the way the government caters to the rich, you might think our society is a plutocracy rather than a democracy. Podiatrist means doctor who treats ailments of the feet. For example, he consulted a podiatrist about his fallen arches. Podium means pedestal, raised platform. For example, the audience applauded as the conductor made his way to the podium. Poignancy means quality of being deeply moving. For example, watching the tearful reunion of the long-separated mother and child, the social worker was touched by the poignancy of the scene. Polarize means split into opposite extremes or camps. For example, the abortion issue has polarized the country into pro-choice and anti-abortion camps. Polemical means aggressive in verbal attack. For example, Lexi was a master of polemical rhetoric. She should have worn a t-shirt with the slogan "Born to Debate." Politic means expedient, prudent, well-advised. For example, even though he was disappointed by the size of the bonus he was offered, he did not think it politic to refuse it. Polygamist means one who has more than one spouse at a time. For example, he was arrested as a polygamist when his 2 wives filed complaints about him. Polyglot means speaking several languages. For example, New York City is a polyglot community because of the thousands of immigrants who settle there. Pomposity means self-important behavior. For example, although the commencement speaker had some good things to say, we had to laugh at his pomposity and general air of parading his own dignity. Ponderous means weighty, unwieldy. For example, his humor lacked the light touch, his jokes were always ponderous. Pontifical means pertaining to a bishop or pope. For example, from his earliest days at the seminary, John seemed destined for a high pontifical office. Pore means study industriously, ponder, scrutinize. For example, determined to become a physician, Beth spent hours poring over her anatomy text. Porous means full of pores, like a sieve. For example, dancers like to wear porous clothing because it allows the ready passage of water and air. Portend means foretell, presage. For example, the king did not know what these omens might portend and asked his soothsayers to interpret them. Portent means sign, forewarning. For example, he regarded the black cloud as a portent of evil. Portly means stately. For example, the overweight gentleman was referred to as portly by the polite sales clerk. Poseur means person who pretends to be sophisticated. For example, some thought Salvador Dali was a brilliant painter, others dismissed him as a poseur. Posterity means descendants, future generations. For example, we hope to leave a better world to posterity. Posthumous means after death. For example, the critics ignored his works during his lifetime. It was only after the posthumous publication of his last novel that they recognized his great talent. Postulate means essential premise, underlying assumption. For example, the basic postulate of democracy, set forth in the Declaration of Independence, is that all men are created equal. Potable means suitable for drinking. For example, the recent drought in the Middle Atlantic states has emphasized the need for extensive research in ways of making seawater potable. Potent means powerful, persuasive, greatly influential. For example, looking at the expiration date on the cough syrup bottle, we wondered whether the medication would still be potent. Potentate means monarch, sovereign. For example, the potentate spent more time at Monte Carlo than he did at home on his throne. Potential means expressing possibility, latent. For example, this juvenile delinquent is a potential murderer. Potion means dose. For example, Tristan and Isolde drink a love potion in the first act of the opera. Practicable means feasible. For example, the board of directors decided that the plan was practicable and agreed to undertake the project. Practical means based on experience, useful. For example, he was a practical man, opposed to theory. Practitioner means someone engaged in a profession. For example, in need of a hip replacement, Carl sought a practitioner with considerable experience performing this particular surgery. Pragmatic means practical. For example, this coming trip to France should provide me with a pragmatic test of the value of my conversational French class. Pragmatist means practical person. For example, no pragmatist enjoys becoming involved in a game he can never win. Prank means mischievous trick. For example, is tipping over garbage cans on Halloween merely a childish prank, or is it vandalism? Prate means speak foolishly. For example, let us not prate about our good qualities, rather, let our virtues speak for themselves. Prattle means babble. For example, Baby John prattled on and on about the cats and his ball, and the preamble means introductory statement. For example, in the preamble to the Constitution, the purpose of the document is set forth. Precarious means uncertain, risky. For example, saying the stock would be a precarious investment, the broker advised her client against purchasing it. Precedent means guide for future action. For example, if I buy you a car for your 16th birthday, your brothers will want me to buy them cars when they turn 16, too. I can't afford to set such an expensive precedent. Precept means practical rule guiding conduct. For example, love thy neighbor as thyself is a worthwhile precept. Precinct means district or division of a city. For example, Ed McBain's detective novels set in the 87th Precinct provide an exciting picture of police work. Precipice means cliff, dangerous position. For example, suddenly Indiana Jones found himself dangling from the edge of a precipice. Precipitate means rash, premature, hasty, sudden. For example, though I was angry enough to resign on the spot, I had enough sense to keep myself from quitting a job in such a precipitate fashion. Precipitate means throw headlong, hasten. For example, the removal of American political support appears to have precipitated the downfall of the Marcos regime. Precipitous means steep, over hasty. For example, this hill is difficult to climb because it is so precipitous. One slip, and our descent will be precipitous as well. Précis means concise summing up of main points. For example, before making her presentation at the conference, Ellen wrote up a neat précis of the major elements she would cover. Precise means exact. For example, if you don't give me precise directions and a map, I'll never find your place. Preclude means make impossible, eliminate. For example, the fact that the band was already booked to play in Hollywood on New Year's Eve precluded their accepting the New Year's Eve gig in London they were offered. Precocious means advanced in development. For example, listening to the grown-up way the child discussed serious topics, we couldn't help remarking how precocious she was. Precursor means forerunner. For example, though Gray and Burns share many traits with the Romantic poets who followed them, most critics consider them precursors of the Romantic movement, not true Romantics. Predator means person who robs or exploits others. For example, not just cats, but a wide variety of predators: owls, hawks, weasels, foxes catch mice for dinner. Predecessor means former occupant of a post. For example, I hope I can live up to the fine example set by my late predecessor in this office. Predetermine means predestine, influence markedly. For example, Romeo and Juliet believed that fate had predetermined their meeting. Predicament means tricky or dangerous situation, dilemma. For example, tied to the railroad tracks by the villain, Pauline strained against her bonds. How would she escape from this terrible predicament? Predilection means partiality, preference. For example, although I have written all sorts of poetry over the years, I have a definite predilection for occasional verse. Predispose means give an inclination toward. For example, Oleg's love of dressing up his big sister's Barbie doll may have predisposed him to become a fashion designer. Preeminent means outstanding, superior. For example, the king traveled to Boston because he wanted the preeminent surgeon in the field to perform the operation. Preempt means head off, forestall by acting first. For example, hoping to preempt any attempts by the opposition to make educational reform a hot political issue, the candidate set out her own plan to revitalize the public schools. Preen means feel self-satisfaction. For example, as Kitty preened before the mirror, carefully smoothing her shining hair, she couldn't help preening over how pretty she looked. Prehensile means capable of grasping or holding. For example, monkeys use not only their arms and legs but also their prehensile tails in traveling through the trees. Prelate means church dignitary. For example, the Archbishop of Moscow and other high-ranking prelates visited the Russian Orthodox Seminary. Prelude means introduction, forerunner. For example, I am afraid that this border raid is the prelude to more. Premeditate means plan in advance. For example, she had premeditated the murder for months, reading about common poisons and buying weed killer that contained arsenic. Premise means assumption, postulate. For example, based on the premise that there's no fool like an old fool, P.T. Barnum hired a 90-year-old clown for his circus. Premonition means forewarning. For example, we ignored these premonitions of disaster because they appeared to be based on childish fears. Preposterous means absurd, ridiculous. For example, when he tried to downplay his youthful experiments with marijuana by saying he hadn't inhaled, we all thought, what a preposterous excuse. Prerogative means privilege, unquestionable right. For example, the president cannot levy taxes, that is the prerogative of the legislative branch of government. Presage means foretell. For example, the vultures flying overhead presaged the discovery of the corpse in the desert. Prescience means ability to foretell the future. For example, given the current wave of Japan bashing, it does not take prescience for me to foresee problems in our future trade relations with Japan. Presentiment means anticipatory fear. For example, saying goodbye at the airport, Jack had a sudden presentiment that this was the last time he would see Jill. Prestige means impression produced by reputation. For example, many students want to go to Harvard College not for the education offered, but for the prestige of Harvard's name. Presumptuous means overconfident, impertinently bold. For example, Matilda thought it was somewhat presumptuous of the young man to have addressed her without first having been introduced. Pretentious means making unjustified claims. For example, none of the other prize winners are wearing their medals. Isn't it a bit pretentious of you to wear yours? Preternatural means beyond what is normal in nature. For example, Malcolm's mother's total ability to tell when he was lying struck him as almost preternatural. Pretext means excuse. For example, he looked for a good pretext to get out of paying a visit to his aunt. Prevail means induce, triumph over. For example, he tried to prevail on her to type his essay for him. Prevalent means widespread, generally accepted. For example, a radical committed to social change, Reed had no patience with the conservative views prevalent in the America of his day. Prevaricate means lie. For example, some people believe that to prevaricate in a good cause is justifiable and regard such a statement as a white lie. Prey means target of a hunt, victim. For example, in stalking the wild asparagus, Ewell Gibbons has as his prey not wild beasts, but wild plants. Prim means very precise and formal, exceedingly proper. For example, many people commented on the contrast between the prim attire of the young lady and the inappropriate clothing worn by her escort. Primordial means existing at the beginning, rudimentary. For example, the Neanderthal man is one of our primordial ancestors. Primp means groom oneself with care, adorn oneself. For example, the groom stood by idly while his nervous bride-to-be primped one last time before the mirror. Pristine means characteristic of earlier times, primitive. For example, this area has been preserved in all its pristine wildness. Privation means hardship, want. For example, in his youth, he knew hunger and privation. Probe means explore with tools. For example, the surgeon probed the wound for foreign matter before suturing it. Problematic means doubtful, unsettled, questionable. For example, given the way building costs have exceeded estimates for the job, whether the arena will ever be completed is problematic. Proclivity means inclination, natural tendency. For example, watching the 2-year-old voluntarily put away his toys, I was amazed by his proclivity for neatness. Procrastinate means postpone, delay, or put off. For example, looking at 4 years of receipts and checks he still had to sort through, Bob was truly sorry he had procrastinated for so long and not finished filing his taxes long ago. Prod means poke, stir up, urge. For example, if you prod him hard enough, he'll eventually clean his room. Prodigal means wasteful, reckless with money. For example, don't be so prodigal spending my money. When you've earned some money yourself, you can waste it as much as you want. Prodigious means marvelous, enormous. For example, watching the champion weightlifter heave the weighty barbell to shoulder height and then boost it overhead, we marveled at his prodigious strength. Prodigy means marvel, highly gifted child. For example, Menuhin was a prodigy, performing wonders on his violin when he was barely 8 years old. Profane means violate, desecrate, treat unworthily. For example, the members of the mysterious Far Eastern cult sought to kill the British explorer because he had profaned the sanctity of their holy goblet by using it as an ashtray. Profligate means dissipated, wasteful. For example, although surrounded by wild and profligate companions, she nevertheless managed to retain some sense of decency. Profound means deep, not superficial. For example, Freud's remarkable insights into human behavior caused his fellow scientists to honor him as a profound thinker. Profusion means overabundance, lavish expenditure. For example, Freddie was so overwhelmed by the profusion of choices on the menu that he knocked over his wine glass and soaked his host. Progenitor means ancestor. For example, the Roth family, whose progenitors emigrated from Germany early in the 19th century, settled in Peru, Illinois. Progeny means children, offspring. For example, he was proud of his progeny in general, but regarded George as the most promising of all his children. Prognosis means forecasted course of a disease, prediction. For example, if the doctor's prognosis is correct, the patient will be in a coma for at least 24 hours. Projectile means missile. For example, man has always hurled projectiles at his enemy, whether in the form of stones or of highly explosive shells. Proletarian means member of the working class, blue-collar person. For example, workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose, but your chains is addressed to proletarians, not preppies. So is blue-collar holler. Proliferation means rapid growth, spread, multiplication. For example, times of economic hardship inevitably encourage the proliferation of countless get-rich-quick schemes. Prolific means abundantly fruitful. For example, my editors must assume I'm a prolific writer. They expect me to revise 6 books this year. Prolixity means tedious wordiness, verbosity. For example, a writer who suffers from prolixity tells his readers everything they never wanted to know about his subject. Prologue means introduction to a poem. For example, in the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare introduces the audience to the feud between the Montagues and the Capulets. Prolong means make longer, draw out, lengthen. For example, in their determination to discover ways to prolong human life, doctors fail to take into account that longer lives are not always happier ones. Prominent means conspicuous, notable, sticking out. For example, have you ever noticed that Prince Charles's prominent ears make him look like the big-eared character in Mad Comics? Promiscuous means mixed indiscriminately, haphazard, irregular. For example, in the opera La Bohème, we get a picture of the promiscuous life led by the young artists of Paris. Promontory means headland. For example, they erected a lighthouse on the promontory to warn approaching ships of their nearness to the shore. Promote means help to flourish, advance in rank. For example, founder of the Children's Defense Fund, Marian Wright Edelman ceaselessly promotes the welfare of young people everywhere. Prompt means cause, provoke. For example, whatever prompted you to ask for such a big piece of cake when you're on a diet? Promulgate means proclaim a doctrine or law. For example, when Moses came down from the mountaintop all set to promulgate God's commandments, he freaked out on discovering his followers worshipping a golden calf. Prone means inclined to, prostrate. For example, she was prone to sudden fits of anger during which she would lie prone on the floor, screaming and kicking her heels. Propagate means multiply, spread. For example, since bacteria propagate more quickly in unsanitary environments, it is important to keep hospital rooms clean. Propellants means substances that propel or drive forward. For example, the development of our missile program has forced our scientists to seek more powerful propellants. Propensity means natural inclination. For example, convinced of his own talent, Sol has an unfortunate propensity to belittle the talents of others. Prophetic means foretelling the future. For example, I have no magical prophetic powers. When I predict what will happen, I base my predictions on common sense. Propinquity means nearness, kinship. For example, their relationship could not be explained as being based on mere propinquity. They were more than relatives, they were true friends. Propitiate means appease. For example, the natives offered sacrifices to propitiate the gods. Propitious means favorable, fortunate, advantageous. For example, Chloe consulted her horoscope to see whether Tuesday would be a propitious day to dump her boyfriend. Proponent means supporter, backer. For example, in the Senate, proponents of the universal health care measure lobbied to gain additional support for the controversial legislation. Propound means put forth for analysis. For example, in your discussion, you have propounded several questions. Let us consider each one separately. Propriety means fitness, correct conduct. For example, Miss Manners counsels her readers so that they may behave with due propriety in any social situation and not embarrass themselves. Propulsive means driving forward. For example, the jet plane has a greater propulsive power than the engine-driven plane. Prosaic means dull and unimaginative, matter-of-fact. For example, though the ad writers came up with an original way to publicize the product, the head office rejected it for a more prosaic, ordinary slogan. Proscribe means banish, outlaw. For example, Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus proscribed all those who had conspired against Julius Caesar. Proselytize means convert to a religion or belief. For example, in these interfaith meetings, there must be no attempt to proselytize. We must respect all points of view. Prosperity means good fortune, financial success. For example, promising to stay together for richer, for poorer, the newlyweds vowed to be true to one another in prosperity and hardship alike. Prostrate means stretch out full on ground. For example, he prostrated himself before the idol. Protean means versatile, able to take on many shapes. For example, a remarkably protean actor, Alec Guinness, could take on any role. Protégé means person receiving protection and support from a patron. For example, born with an independent spirit, Cyrano de Bergerac refused to be a protégé of Cardinal Richelieu. Protocol means diplomatic etiquette. For example, we must run this state dinner according to protocol if we are to avoid offending any of our guests. Prototype means original work used as a model by others. For example, the crude typewriter on display in this museum is the prototype of the elaborate machines in use today. Protract means prolong. For example, seeking to delay the union members' vote, the management team tried to protract the negotiations endlessly. Protrude means stick out. For example, his fingers protruded from the holes in his gloves. Protuberance means protrusion, bulge. For example, a ganglionic cyst is a fluid-filled tumor that develops near a joint membrane or tendon sheath, and that bulges beneath the skin, forming a protuberance. Provident means displaying foresight, thrifty. For example, in his usual provident manner, he had insured himself against this type of loss. Provincial means pertaining to a province, unsophisticated. For example, as provincial governor, Sir Henry administered the Queen's law in his remote corner of Canada. Provisional means tentative. For example, Kim's acceptance as an American Express card holder was provisional. Before issuing her a card, American Express wanted to check her employment record and credit history. Provocative means arousing anger or interest, annoying. For example, in a typically provocative act, the bully kicks sand into the weaker man's face. Provoke means stir to anger, cause retaliation. For example, in order to prevent a sudden outbreak of hostilities, we must not provoke our foe. Prowess means extraordinary ability, military bravery. For example, performing triple axels and double lutzes at the age of 6, the young figure skater was world famous for her prowess on the ice. Proximity means nearness. For example, blind people sometimes develop a compensatory ability to sense the proximity of objects around them. Proxy means authorized agent. For example, please act as my proxy and vote for this slate of candidates in my absence. Prude means excessively modest person. For example, the X-rated film was definitely not for prudes. Prudent means cautious, careful. For example, a miser hoards money not because he is prudent but because he is greedy. Prune means cut away, trim. For example, with the help of her editor, she was able to prune her overlong manuscript into publishable form. Prurient means having or causing lustful thoughts and desires. For example, aroused by his prurient impulses, the dirty old man leered at the sweet young thing and offered to give her a sample of his prowess. Pseudonym means pen name. For example, Samuel Clemens' pseudonym was Mark Twain. Psyche means soul, mind. For example, it is difficult to delve into the psyche of a human being. Pterodactyl means extinct flying reptile. For example, the remains of pterodactyls indicate that these flying reptiles had a wingspan of as much as 20 feet. Puerile means childish. For example, his puerile pranks sometimes offended his more mature friends. Pugilist means boxer. For example, the famous pugilist Cassius Clay changed his name to Muhammad Ali. Pugnacity means combativeness, disposition to fight. For example, put up your dukes, he cried, making a fist to show his pugnacity. Pulchritude means beauty, comeliness. For example, I do not envy the judges who have to select this year's Miss America from this collection of female pulchritude. Pulverize means crush or grind into dust. For example, before sprinkling the dried herbs into the stew, Michael first pulverized them into a fine powder. Pummel means beat or pound with fists. For example, swinging wildly, Pam pummeled her brother around the head and shoulders. Punctilious means minutely attentive to fine points. For example, Percy is punctilious about observing the rules of etiquette whenever Miss Manners invites him to stay. Pundit means authority on a subject, learned person. For example, some authors who write about SATI as if they are pundits actually know very little about the test. Pungent means stinging, sharp in taste or smell. For example, the pungent odor of ripe Limburger cheese appealed to Simone but made Stanley gag. Punitive means punishing. For example, he asked for punitive measures against the offender. Puny means insignificant, tiny, weak. For example, our puny efforts to stop the flood were futile. Purchase means firm grasp or footing. For example, the mountaineers struggled to get a proper purchase on the slippery rock. Purge means remove or get rid of something unwanted. For example, when the communist government purged the party to get rid of members suspected of capitalist sympathies, they sent the disloyal members to labor camps in Siberia. Purported means alleged, claimed, reputed. For example, The purported Satanists sacrificing live roosters in the park turned out to be a party of Shriners holding a chicken barbecue. Purse means pucker, contract into wrinkles. For example, Miss Watson pursed her lips to show her disapproval of Huck's bedraggled appearance. Purveyor means furnisher of foodstuffs, caterer. For example, as purveyor of rare wines and viands, he traveled through France and Italy every year in search of new products to sell. Pusillanimous means cowardly, faint-hearted. For example, you should be ashamed of your pusillanimous conduct during this dispute. Putrid means foul, rotten, decayed. For example, the gangrenous condition of the wound was indicated by the putrid smell when the bandages were removed. Pyromaniac means person with an insane desire to set things on fire. For example, the detectives searched the area for the pyromaniac who had set these costly fires. End of the word list with words starting with letter P.